Good evening. This is Dr. Long. It's April 22nd, Wednesday, 2015. April 22nd, 2015. It's 8 o'clock. So we're going to combine some theory and some application today. And in so doing, I'll be taking the advice of a guy whose research is recognized for excellence up in Canada. He's a methods author that I came across while doing some side research for this course on qualitative research. I like to bring in different perspectives. And I came across his writings and his material, and it sounded very interesting to me. So interesting that I wanted to just go ahead and try a recommendation from his own practice of teaching graduate students about research methods. And hopefully this is something that you'll enjoy and something that you can apply as we go through the course. It's basically going to involve me working on a live qualitative research project side by side with you, going through the same tasks that you are, and then sharing with you how I am setting mine up, and in so doing maybe provide a more concrete example for what qualitative research in actual practice looks like. So we'll see how that goes, and I'm very interested in your feedback. Let me know if it's useful or helpful, or if it's not useful or helpful. I need to know that too, so I can shift my attention elsewhere. So the book that I'm referencing this from is called Doing Qualitative Research, subtitled A Praxis of Method, by a guy named Michael Roth, who works up in Canada, Western Canada, Simon Fraser University and University of Victoria. Now there's a very specific use of this word praxis, spelled with an X, P-R-A-X-I-S. And it sounds like the word practice, and it's related to the word practice. The technical meaning of that has to do with the literature dealing with the routine processes that are associated with a profession or a society or a group or an organization that's repeated over time, which has something like, if not the force of law, it has something like professional best practices. And the body of knowledge that's contained in those practices, as they are repeated through time and reinforced by the profession, are called collectively praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S. And so the subtitle, Praxis of Method, has to do with the idea of how we as researchers conduct methodological researches. How do we go about doing the business of methodological studies? Is a technical term used in social science that describes the body of knowledge contained in professional practices that have something like the force of law. They're considered best practices that you wouldn't violate. In the military, it would be something like doctrinal procedures that represent the normal way we do things, and that to a professional standard has expectations by other members of the profession that you would follow the rules and stay true to the discipline. So the subtitle, Praxis of Method, is his way of titling this book and telling us that this textbook on methodology is more about how methods are applied in the real world, and not so much a disembodied piece of theory that addresses different kinds of methods. He's going to be taking us through, in this textbook, actual projects and showing how he, an experienced qualitative researcher, actually makes the choices and develops his research program. In other words, how he applies the method. I should say now that the slides and the sketches that I've made for this are already uploaded in the files section in the virtual classroom, so you could either follow along or refer to them later. Let's see, I'll make this bigger. So just to summarize his ideas, I've highlighted just a few pieces of text. So from his background, for a dozen years he'd been teaching research design and methods at a variety of places in using textbooks, and he found that his students were generally complaining about the textbooks, and the complaints were about how the books were written and the problems that the students were having in trying to apply the textbook like a recipe to their own research. And they said that the textbooks were too philosophical and too general, and they didn't help them with the concrete research situations they found themselves in. And he found that his students were asking him questions all the time, like, how do you do your research? And how do you make sense of so much data? And how do you write your research? So this is typical of, the approach of let's say a novice or a journeyman when talking with an experienced practitioner or a master. Or if you think of a martial arts model, this would be the new students asking the black belt, how do you throw that? How do you throw that punch? How do you perform the kata? How do you handle that weapon? And he found that those were kind of awkward questions, because now he was trying to talk about how he was doing it, and when he was doing it, he rarely thought about it in the way that a textbook would have you think about it. He just sort of knew what to do and then just did it, and didn't spend a lot of time thinking about why he did what he did. And then as he started reflecting on his own teaching practice, what he realized was that in the area of statistics, which he taught, the way he learned statistics was not by looking at methodological textbooks, but really by applying the statistics to the research that he was doing. So he learned by doing. He wasn't applying a methodology, he would say, but he was practicing research and then brought these things into the live project. And so what he discovered was that his way of planning, doing, and writing research, to quote him here, was a practice of method rather than an implementation of a method of practice. In other words, he was inside the task and doing things, as opposed to standing outside, consulting a book, and then trying to apply it like a checklist. And so he then came to understand what it was that his students were complaining about. As he thought about not only the students in the classes he was teaching, but also the graduate students that he was supervising, he realized that his own graduate students learned to do the research by actually engaging in practice on a project and figuring out from their own perspective of what made sense, what to do next. And that the textbooks might provide some guidance, but it was really the discussions with their peers and discussion with the expert practitioner, the professor, that was really responsible for the learning that really stuck to them, because they now had something concrete that they could attach their research to. They understood the theory because it was connected to actual practice. Is that making sense so far? Okay. So he talks about in one semester where he only had a couple students, what he did was taught the course, and they wrote their own textbook based on them doing research right alongside him, and then they wrote a textbook based on the experience they had in actually trying to do the research while they were learning the method. So it was a action-based or a practice-based approach to experiential learning. And he was satisfied that that project showed it was possible to integrate practicing the method with teaching the classes. And not just with his graduate students, but also by any students in any class. And so he concluded that we can learn, or we do learn, research methods by doing the method, and that it's only after we have learned and now that you have some practical understanding about what you just learned, then you can talk about the theory and talk about the practice after the fact. And he makes the point that that having textbooks to do that was really unresolved because there were no textbooks that were written in that way. And so he has this guy named Ken Tobin, who's a colleague of his, who said he ought to write about how he practiced the different methods and why they were personally useful, and how he did what he did, as opposed to a dry, disembodied presentation about a theory. He was writing it from a particular perspective as a practitioner from inside the process and sharing his personal story. And he thought that, well, that actually has some limits because it's constrained to his view of things. On the other hand, it seemed to bring the material to life, and it was found to be very useful by his students. And so that caused him to write the current book that I'm highlighting for you here. And it is his story of how he has applied, he covers 6 different methods in the rest of this book. And it was written for a combination of folks that are senior undergraduate students and grad students and faculty members, and collects not just theoretical insights, but advice and commentary about how the task is being done, and not just a summary of the projects. All right, let's see if I think that was everything I wanted to say. And so the rest of this section just really talks about some of the some peripheral material about why these particular methods and who helped him write the book and so forth. But the highlighted portions were the pieces that I wanted to cover. And so I've made the entire introduction available to you, but I'm not going to cover it here. It describes some important aspects of how he chose to share pieces of his research. What I found interesting, and the reason I came across his book was he talks about this guy Garfinkel on page minus 15 of the introduction. He talks about being influenced by the work of Harold Garfinkel. And I think that's actually how I came across his work, because I was actually doing some work on Garfinkel's techniques. Now, Garfinkel invented his own methodology in qualitative research called Ethno Methodology. It sounds similar to ethnography, which we will study, but he called it Ethno Methodology. And his concern there was not in the detailed stories from the personal point of view of the people who were in the social setting. His area of interest was in the practical, routine, unconscious processes that the people in a group use to unconsciously make meaning out of their ordinary lives. His idea was that there were certain methods that we engage in as social beings that are used to create order and consistency and coherence from day to day, the way we make day-to-day meaning out of all the sensory evidence that's happening. And his idea was that a lot of these things were done at the unconscious level, and that they've been handed down generation to generation without being questioned. And so he called this phenomenon, these processes, the study of them, he called this ethno methodology. And he was more concerned about what kind of rituals and routine processes, what kind of icons, what kind of cultural artifacts were used in the production of this shared common sense view of the world. And he called that whole process of creating meaning in a group a methodology of making sense, or ethno-methodology when you localize it to a particular group. So I'm kind of interested in that, because when the research that I've been doing with action research was concerned with sense making and how large organizations go about their routine practices to gather information to solve problems that they have selected, to make decisions along the way, and how they use social norms and ritual processes to actually get that work done routinely, because I think that's connected to culture, or the way we do things around here. The unconscious reality that has a lot of power in how things are done. And in many cases, when you're trying to engage in transformation, the ideas that sound really good in your head, that sound like they can be very interesting, run up against this unspoken body of knowledge, or unspoken encyclopedia of processes that runs into this ethno methodology that resists change because it's different than the way that we have unconsciously learned to do things. People somehow resist these rational good ideas for change with some kind of subjective or subconscious rejection of the new ideas because it doesn't conform to their unspoken reality about how things are supposed to work. When you've been taught a certain way of doing things and it's become socialized into you, and it's not even operating at the conscious level, any deviation from that doesn't feel right, even if there's no reason for it to feel wrong that you can point to. There's just some kind of visceral, physical, or emotional feeling that somehow this is different and shouldn't be trusted. It represents a danger to the cohesion of the tribe or the cohesion of the status quo, which seems to be doing okay so far. And so Harold Garfinkel's idea was that this ethno methodology is something that could be studied, and it was related to but distinct from ethnography, which is more about the conscious methods that individuals use to make sense out of their own lives as members of a society. So whereas in ethnography, you could expect to pick some key individuals or key stakeholders and conduct extensive interviews and go deeply into their sense-making apparatus and really check their conscious values in the decisions they make and really explore the individual's deep understanding. Ethnomethodology, on the other hand, doesn't go to the depth of the conscious thinking, but it really takes a look at these automatic social processes that are setting the agenda for what seems to be possible or not. So although both are talking about social groups, they're looking at really distinctly different elements of societies. Is that making sense so far? Okay, let me take a half a second break. I had to bring my dogs in. They're trying to fight their way through the fence. Come on. Puppies, come on. Come here. Come on. Let's go. Good cage. Here we go. Sorry about the interruption. I have a couple huskies, and although we have a dog fence around the yard, they can almost wiggle their way through it when they get excited, and the neighbor's cat came over to visit, and so the dogs always try to get after him. The cat teases him, so I needed to bring him in. Okay, so I only mentioned that stuff on ethnomethodology because I have been doing some work on that. And that ethnomethodology is what led me to this guy, Wolf Michael, what's his name, Wolf Michael Roth. And then I really wanted to see what he was saying about Garfinkel, and that led me to reading some of his other stuff. And I was really intrigued by the idea of doing a practical application of my own qualitative research live in the course to see if that might be of interest to you. So that's what I'm going to start sharing now, is where I am with a project that I happen to be working on. So with your permission, I'm going to go ahead and jump into that. So far, so good? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about is a qualitative research that I am tentatively doing. I'm actually doing it. I haven't gotten formal permission from my organization yet because they're not even sure what it is that I'm doing. I'm keeping it hidden to a certain extent, and I'm trying to encourage them to think along the lines that I'm suggesting, so that they would then be interested in the qualitative research that I'm proposing. If I just come out and lay it right out, might be too easy for them to say no because we're so busy. So I want to try to have them see the need for it at their own speed, so that the idea of actually doing the research becomes their idea and not mine, and then the probability that I can get it done gets increased. And so part of that is just knowing the organization that I'm in and how it makes decisions, and then shaping my engagements in such a way as to encourage them to do things that I think are in their best interest, but without being overly surreptitious. I mean, I feel like in some way I'm using my power for, I think I'm using my powers for good. I'm not doing any harm to the organization. And I actually check that with some other people who know what I'm doing, and to make sure that I'm not being unethical or anything. So this is just me working within the boundaries of a system that I am something of an expert with. So what I'm going to describe has to do with how a profession that is organized in a hierarchical way, in this case the United States Army, is working to develop its own leaders, developing a new generation of leaders for today and tomorrow and the next 10 years, and the way that they're going about doing it, and then some ways that I think qualitative research can help them improve the development of their own people by essentially having them appreciate what qualitative research is. And I'm going to try to demonstrate to them that the same habits of mind and the processes that we use in qualitative research will actually create the kinds of leaders with the right kinds of traits and skills to become successful in the world that they describe in the future. So this is going to be very much a case of using qualitative research as a tool to help this profession, help this organization transform their own organizational development processes, or how to develop their own leaders from the inside. So in that sense, there's an action research quality to this. There could be a ethnographic quality to it if I interviewed certain key people about the process that we're going to engage in. There could be an ethno methodology associated with the way the organization makes decisions at the unconscious level. There could be a case study if I were to go deeply into developing case materials from many different sources that could be used to create a rich description of this environment, so people could understand how maybe organizational politics influence decision making, and how the environment that they were in shaped the decisions that they saw that they could make, how it either limited their view or expanded their perspectives. It could be a phenomenological case study, in the sense that if I wanted to concentrate on the personal interpretation of what was going on from their own perspective, as opposed to trying to come to a certain conclusion or a recommendation, I could shape this problem area into the direction of phenomenological research. So there are a lot of choices that I can make here, because I'm in a situation that is very rich with opportunities and possibilities. And then depending on what I think is interesting or important or consistent with my own research goals, I could decide how to proceed And so what I mean by this is that there's not necessarily one way that is the preferred way to do this, that depending on what I think is interesting or ought to be done has a lot to do with the decision I might make about what kind of particular methodology to apply. And I would say that the insights that I'm sharing here, although they are about the Army and the military hierarchy, there is an awful lot of application to other large organizations that are hierarchical in nature, and especially the professions. And so this is not just a case study about the Army. This actually is something that could pertain to any large organization, and it just happens to be the Army, which just happens to have a very strong hierarchical organizational structure. Okay, so far so good? Okay, so in one sense, the Army is actually engaged right now, as we speak, trying to think out loud and in an intelligent way about its own culture. We are actually running an ethics symposium and workshop where experts in Army culture coming in and talking about the Army profession from their perspective, because it's an object of study, and we're trying to see if it actually fits with the future that we envision for the Army and the way that it acts as a part of a democratic society. So culture is very much on our mind and a topic of discussion. And I've seen it actually at both ends of the spectrum, at the top level, where we start with discussions of culture, but I've also seen how different members of this hierarchical organization respond to the things that the leadership are saying, and that has important things to say about what kind of a culture we are. So there's almost like culture with a capital C, which is the espoused culture, or what the leadership promotes and certifies and validates and publishes. And then there's the inside culture, or even subcultures or countercultures, which has everything to do with the way that the people at the different levels in the organization respond to the leadership guidance or directives or examples set by the leadership. So we'll see how that shapes out. Some distinct features about this profession and this general problem area is that there's what we would call senior leaders, whose job it is to speak for this hierarchical profession. And their job is actually to look out into the future and to create a vision, hopefully a shared vision, about the future and what the nature of war and peace are likely to be, and to describe the role of the Army inside of that future state. So they have they're describing a vision of what we want the Army to be, how we want to fight, how we want it to engage in peace, how to partner with others, and then what kind of future condition the Army should be in when it gets out to that future state. So your question was, countercultures are those that go against the overall culture. Yeah, sometimes they go against directly, sometimes they could be neutral, but if you think of a counterculture, it's usually thought of as a subset inside the larger primary culture that has a different code or a different message or different responses, or they set themselves up in opposition to the party line. They're not buying the status quo. They still see themselves as part of the larger culture, but they are adopting something like, let's say, a minority party. So if you were thinking of Congress as a culture, and whatever, which one of the political parties has the numerical advantage, whoever's the majority, they can set the conditions for how things are going to be done. And you might see the opposition party as being a counter culture, or in some cases fighting against the larger culture. Or if you think about the 60s, which had inherited all of the traditional conservative Republican values from the very successful economic times of the 1950s, the 1960s were characterized by counterculture experience in which young people were experimenting with drugs and free love and arguing against authority and resisting the war in Vietnam and exploring new forms of music and language and breaking down racial and gender and religious barriers. And so all of those collectively could be thought of as countercultures operating sometimes directly against the culture, sometimes simply going in a different direction but without being in direct opposition. Okay, so is that making sense? Okay. So one of the things that we see is that the leadership produces an artifact, they would call it guidance, which describes what this vision and intent of the future would be and how we're going to get there. They also approve doctrinal principles for the profession, which we would say are those tried and true, timeless practices, the best practices for the profession, the things that we ought to do. Then we might actually think of the practice itself as the methods that are accepted as best practices where doctrine is put into practice in the field, and sort of we have techniques for how to get things done. You might think of them as methods of applying doctrine, and we have a corporate body of knowledge which says these are the ways that you can conduct the offense that have seemed to work in the past. So we might have a doctrine that talks about offense and defense, or stability, or building partnerships with other nations. And then the ways that you actually do it, we could consider that to be the practice. And so once these things are defined, or as they are being defined, we also establish the institution, in this case the Command and General Staff College, who has been given guidance from the leadership. The leadership tells the institution that you have to do two things simultaneously. Number one, you have to inculcate the culture's values and doctrine and best practices. You have that mission in order to produce officers who can do things in the Army way, like planning, leading organizations, providing discipline, training, behaving in typical Army ways. And they choose the word inculcation very carefully, because to inculcate someone means that it's almost like indoctrination, where you're trying to install in their brain a value structure and a way of doing business that is standardized or uniform throughout the organization. So if it was an accounting firm and you wanted to do best accounting practices or generally accepted accounting principles, you would want people to think in that way. You would be inculcating them to think the way accountants think, or in this case, to think the way Republicans think, or in another case, or in this particular case, think the way Army officers think and uphold the values of the organization. So this is very much about standardization and applying the best practices. And the idea is that over the last 273 years, we've learned some important timeless lessons about wartime leadership, and we want to make sure that the people that take over leadership of our organizations can put those things into practice so that we have continuity, so that what made the Army strong will keep it strong in the future. So one of the missions of that institution, this military college, is to inculcate, to standardize these values and doctrine. But at the same time, we know that from taking a look out with our vision into the future, what we're going to need also are leaders who are capable of independent, creative thought and critical thinking. And we use a term called mission command, which says that the future is so complicated that we can't predict everything you're going to need to know. So instead, what we have to do is teach you how to think, to imbue you with these principles, but to keep your mind open so that you can gather information, figure out what needs to be done, and then we trust you to do it confidently and capably and to achieve mission success. So in many ways, this is the very opposite of doctrine. It says we have to keep you free enough and inquisitive enough, curious enough, and capable of doing independent thinking so that you can figure out what needs to be done, rather than waiting for the organization to sort it out. to produce new doctrine, have that disseminated, and then trade. We don't have time for you to do that. We need you to be dynamic and adaptive. So we have a tension established between these two competing missions of the institution, both of which are important for the profession to be successful, but which are often quite distinct and opposite from each other. On one side, you want inculcated with everybody thinking the same way and upholding the same values. And on the other hand, you want them to be independent thinkers who are not just yes men, but you want them to be free spirits and responsible for their own creativity. Does that tension make sense to you? Do you see how that could create some problems in practice? So that's exactly the problem that we have. We start off with this hierarchy, which gives guidance to a leader and says, we want you to perform your missions in accordance with these broad values that we've described. And then we're going to give you a specific mission to accomplish. And then given your starting state, we're going to ask you to make a rapid estimate of what needs to be done, so a rapid decision-making process, apply some judgment, take responsibility for all your actions, use initiative and the resources we've granted you to come up with some kind of sensible action that's going to lead to some results that we hope move us towards this desired future state. And then once the results come in, we're going to evaluate everything that went on, and we're going to interpret what happened and try to make sense out of it. And then we're going to keep doing that over and over again. And then the way we respond to the actions you took and the results you got and how we described it in terms of narrative or interpretation, that's going to go into some kind of memory bank, and we're going to remember how leaders and organizations in the world responded to the specific events we went through, and that the accumulated effects add up to something like our culture, that we have institutional as well as individual memory, which goes into creating the next starting state the next time we get a mission. So we never start at ground zero. There's always some organizational and interpersonal memories that shape what we think is important or possible or the way we do business. So there's some real tension now in this institution to figure out, given the amount of time that we only have 1 year and about 1,000 hours of classroom time, how are we going to balance the need to inculcate values and yet at the same time develop critical and creative thinkers? Yes, exactly. To be free and creative on the one hand, but then also operate within disciplined constraints in other places. So when it comes to actually working in the classroom, we develop things like lesson plans that are going to standardize the way we think these lessons ought to be taught, but in practice they're going to be delivered by 64 different teachers to 64 groups of 16. So we'll have anything like anywhere from 1,000 to 1,300 officers being taught in small groups. And so the lesson plans talk about the intent of the lesson, why we're teaching that, and the specific broad outcomes we hope to achieve, and then they provide a procedure or a way that this lesson could be taught that the lesson author and the leadership thinks is a reliable way of achieving the objectives. And so we try to take the position that the lesson plan can be taught by anybody kind of in the same way, and so we want to standardize that. But at the very same time, we also know that our doctrine says that plans can never fully capture the true complexity of the world, and the world in the classroom is very complex. And so we should say that a lesson plan shouldn't pretend to be the one-size-fits-all answer, and that it should simply describe the intent and the outcome and suggest a way it might be done, but put the trust in the faculty to make large and small decisions based on the situation they find themselves in the classroom and how they apply those decisions to the students with all of their qualities, and teach it in a way that makes the most sense for their particular situation, 1 out of 64, and that we should trust the faculty to do that, which means that we should then write our lesson plans in such a way that the faculty have more discretion to be able to make these important decisions because they know what's best, or they know the most about that particular situation, and not some lesson author who's trying to write a recipe that could be applied identically in all 64 classrooms. So that's another one of the trade-offs that we have in how we teach. And it turns out that most of the time that the leadership spends on this subject is that they talk about the intent and the outcomes that they desire, and they don't spend very much time at all talking about the procedures. And the problem is that they don't really have really good answers for how do we know that the things that the faculty decides to teach in all these 64 different lessons or these 64 different classrooms, how do we know at the end of the day that what they got is really what we intended? What is the method that we use to ensure that our intent and the desired outcomes actually are being accomplished as interpreted by the faculty in all the little macro and micro decisions that they make? We're spending not nearly enough time discussing how we achieve our objectives throughout the year across the variety of all the different staff groups, and we don't really have a way of answering the question, how are we doing with meeting these intent and outcomes, and how do we know that that's how good we're doing? We're not really using evidence-based metrics to determine if the decisions that the faculty are making turn out to be in support of the outcomes and the intent that we've described up front. We only know that we trust them to do the right thing, and then we just treat the results as hope, and we say, well, I hope they got the right thing. We don't really have a way of connecting the outcomes with the inputs. So this is the background then to the study that I'm going to now propose. The introduction is that I think we could use an inquiry-based approach, in other words, a research-based approach, to the curriculum design. Curriculum design means how we develop these lesson plans. And that the inquiry-based approach not only could help us design lessons better, but it could also be used as a practical exercise in our creative thinking and critical thinking lessons, and that we could use inquiry, the whole process of creating good research questions, as a way to help people understand how they themselves can clarify what senior leaders mean by intent. In the same way that a doctoral student uses the process of research questioning, developing the research question and design, as a way to improve our understanding of what we want, that the committee and the student together develop a deeper understanding of the problem and the question by going back and forth in dialogue, and it turns out that you use both critical thinking and creative thinking, which is what we say we want. I also am proposing to them that the use of a research-based approach or an inquiry-based approach is an example of how we can use models, not only in doing research, but in structuring problems that are difficult to solve, using models to help us improve our performance on problem solving. And then it's also going to be a demonstration of how we can do action learning, which combines research with effective action, to not only do better, but to develop understanding about our environment. And then I'm going to demonstrate in this proposal the idea of valencing, which allows us to, which is a qualitative technique that can be used to help us sort through complicated areas. Making sense so far? Okay, I want you to notice that I've handwritten these slides. I've been experimenting with the use of handwritten slides as opposed to PowerPoint. And what I'm discovering is that I am much more productive when I handwrite it, and the people tend to listen more carefully to what I'm talking about because the handwriting seems to be alive. It doesn't have that air of formality, of sterile formality that PowerPoint has, that the live writing tends to help people connect to what's going on. And so I wanted to share that idea with you guys by sharing the handwritten slides. And if it makes sense, someday these can end up becoming PowerPoints. But for right now, what I'm really discovering is that there's real power in the use of these live created artifacts. They seem to be personal, and they have a lot more power than if I had made these PowerPoint slides. So just something to file away in your memory banks there. So if this was the introduction and some of the outcomes, I move into the describing the problem area, and I talk about that there seems to me to be a series of tensions and trade-offs between competing values in our profession, which are causing frustration among leaders, lesson designers and authors, faculty members and students. And I've described two of those tensions already. One of them was the difference between inculcating and developing free thinkers. And then the idea that the tension between which should take preference, the lesson plan as written or the judgment of faculty to interpret. Which one of those should we put the highest priority on? And when we are not clear about the trade-offs, people use their own interpretation, and then differences of opinion that aren't resolved can lead to frustration. Well, the main idea behind this notion of competing values or competing value continuum comes from some work done by Cameron and Quinn called the Competing Values Framework, in which they take a look at competition between two sides on a continuum, and both of which are really worthy, that there's no one clear-cut winner, that there's reasons why you would want to inculcate members of a profession, and at the same time you would like to generate independent thinkers. Each one of those has a strong argument of why it's important, and the real challenge is figuring out for that organization where the trade-off should be. Should they be equally balanced? Should we favor one or the other slightly or completely? And so getting the where the trade-off should be based on multiple opinions and perspectives is what Cameron and Quinn call the competing value structure. So there's a lot of literature been done on that in the qualitative area, and it's a fascinating area to study, particularly with culture and with organizations that have to make a lot of decisions. And so I propose to the leaders here that there needs to be very clear trade-off decisions made in order to produce an actual curriculum that uses clear guidance on their intent for how they want the faculty to resolve matters of judgment in the classroom routinely. Because I take the position that the faculty have to make macro and micro decisions all the time about when to move on to a new topic, or when to emphasize individual development or group development. Which one of those is more important right now based on who my students are and what they're interested in and what I think their needs are. And we are entrusting faculty to make those decisions, so it seems to me that the lesson plan should give some guidance that's very clear from what the leaders desire the outcome to be, so that we can be good, loyal, supportive teachers as part of a larger vision. But if they're not clear with that guidance, then you have every faculty member feeling like they're at risk or adrift in the wilderness, or at worst being disloyal or confused about what is really supposed to be the decision rule. And finally, Cameron and Quinn talk about the idea that in competing values, that where you decide to draw the line for these trade-offs is part of a legitimate professional debate that should be open up to many people to weigh in on before we make decisions, that making arbitrary decisions is not a good thing. And so if that's the general problem area, I then narrow it down to a more concrete research hypothesis in this next section, where I say that I make the following hypothesis. If we can identify the stakeholder groups in this professional debate, and if we can map what their opinions are or their positions that they individually and as interest groups take on these different trade-offs, then we might be able to visualize, communicate, decide, and disseminate our corporate intent by the use of a model that describes where we should be on each of these trade-offs that we can describe. And that through the use of such a model, maybe we can improve our collective understanding of our overall mission, and then where different people are, and what the essence of the debate is. And so that instead of being engaged in personality conflicts, we can actually look at the model and make informed decisions collectively as professionals. So if that research hypothesis makes sense, I then say the procedure for doing that would be, well, first I want to build a model that collects all these tensions, what I call tensions and trade-offs, and do it iteratively by doing with other people that are interested in the area, and then socialize that model with others to make sure that they understand what we mean before we use it and that they can improve it, and now they have some ownership in that model and then they're more likely to participate. And then use a small pilot program to gather some data to test whether or not that model actually can generate interesting ideas which could be used in this research hypothesis. So we're doing a proof of principle of this hypothesis which says we can actually construct a model that describes these tensions and trade-offs, gather data, and then use that to improve the way we talk about these trade-offs to begin with. So what I've done here is I've gone from a general problem area that is kind of vague and very strategic and fuzzy and moved through a series of refinements in a process that comes down to kind of a step-by-step approach to how I might organize this process. And notice that I haven't even checked the methodology yet, but what I'm doing is clearly trying to scope this down, and if I can narrow it to a research question and procedure, I might then be able to pick a particular method to best answer the questions that we come up with. Does that make sense so far? So the goals and the outcomes and the values all tend to go back and forth in like a little tug of war that is ultimately going to steer me towards a methodology that seems to fit. So this is the first set of work we did on developing that qualitative model, and I said the tentative research questions were: what is the perception from faculty and leadership about where we are on each of these dozen different I think there's 10 different trade-offs. So one of them we've already kind of talked about. At one point there's some folks who say we need to work on our group processes because Army staffs are groups of people that are working together as a team. And so I have to be spending time teaching guys how to be members of a team, how to be good teammates, how that team works, what the different roles and responsibilities are in the processes they use. And directly opposite from that, however, is this idea of I need to teach individuals how to be effective as an individual, and I can't spend unlimited time on both areas, so I have to make a trade-off between sometimes working in a group and sometimes working at the individual level, and I have to make a decision about which one is more important, or are they equally weighted. At the same time, I have to consider things like, should I focus on good execution of a plan and work on the process itself, coming up with good products, or should I spend time in having the students reflect on the process that they followed and see how they can maybe more deeply understand the theory behind it and how they might apply it in other areas. So I'm not as concerned about the particular problem they solved, but more about their general problem-solving approach. So I see a tension between emphasizing execution and emphasizing reflection. Well, I'm not going to go down each and every one of these trade-offs. Maybe I will at a later date. But each one of these things has a particular tension inside of our profession. Like in one hand, I need to emphasize disciplined process and everybody kind of doing things according to the rules. At the same time, I also want to encourage them to innovate and use initiative. Sometimes I want guys to do structured analysis. Other times I want them to use improvisation and just try something new and see where it goes, just in case it might be something new. And I've already talked about the idea of inculcating versus exploring. So in cooperation with some others, we've already identified about 10 different trade-offs that are of interest. And what we actually want to measure are, where do we think, if I'm a faculty member and I ask them, where does that faculty member think the organization is on the trade-off between each of these dimensions? And then how important do they think it is to get that trade-off right? Because not all of these things are of equal value to everybody. So some of them might be more important than others. So if we were engaged in a political process, in order to achieve a win on something I thought was important, I might be able to let somebody else win in some area that I don't think is as important to me. And so because people will have different weights about what's important or not, there's an opportunity there in a social process or a political process to develop constituencies or collaboration or compromise. So that at the end of the day, everybody gets something, but not everybody gets everything. And everybody has something to win or something to lose. Not everybody's 100% satisfied. Nobody is 0% satisfied. That we have an accommodation of these competing values. So the things that I want to measure then have to do with what is the actual position that people think we're in, how important do they think it is, and then I will ask them, if you were king for a day and you could just direct it to be ideal, what would you consider to be the ideal position if you got to have your way on every single one of these? And then what I can do is actually measure the difference between the ideal and the actual, see how much difference there is, multiply it by the importance that person says, and that will tell me something about how important overall change in that area will be for them. That's called that balancing technique that I described. Okay, how are we doing so far? So far, so good? Okay, yeah, let me give you a direct example. So let's suppose that I took one of these trade-offs, and I'm going to talk about group versus individual, okay? And let's say that I made a trade-off scale using a 7-point Likert scale. So this might be, I might put the group on the left side, and I might put the individual on the right side. And so there were 7 positions that a person could take. If they chose the one in the middle, number 4, what they would say is, let's say we were talking about what is ideal. If they thought it was extremely important to have a perfect balance between group development and individual development, they would put a circle, they would color in the circle in the middle, and they would say that's ideally where the curriculum should be, perfectly balanced between the group and the individual. Does that make sense? So now if I put the group on the left and I started moving out on the scale, if I moved one position to the left, that's where I would say, well, I think both of these are important, but the group development has a slight but clear priority over the individual. And so I would want to give a minor but clear victory to the group. If I went out another position to the second dot away, I could say, the group is a clear priority, and even though the other one, individual, should be addressed, it's very much secondary to first ensuring that I get the group done correctly. And if I went to the extreme and I said that the group was extraordinarily important, I would say something like, I would fill that in if I believed that group development should dominate individual development to such an extent that you should never worry about individual development until you were absolutely sure that you had completely accomplished the group development mission. So what I've got is increasing levels of victory towards the trade-off position on one side or the other. And then the things on the right-hand side would be a mirror image. So if I filled in the one on the right, that I would then be saying that individual development is so important that I should have that mastered before I do any group development. So do you understand what I mean now by that 7-point scale? Okay, good. Now let's suppose, now we talk about valencing. We might actually take that group and individual one, and let's say when I'm valencing, I come down here and I say, the first question I ask them to do is I say, place where you think the college is putting its emphasis. What is the actual emphasis that the college wants you to manifest in the classroom? And if they filled in that first circle like I've shown here, then what they would be saying is that their perception is that the leadership of the college wants them to ensure that group development is done first and foremost to a high degree of mastery before we begin to worry about individual development. Does that make sense? Good. So then the second question I would ask him is, in your personal opinion as an experienced faculty member, and probably as a retired member of the profession where you served honorably for 25 years, if you were king for the day, where would you put the trade-off, the ideal location? And let's say in this case, they went to the position number 5, which is one to the right of the perfect balance. The perfect balance is the one in the center. And let's say a person decided that their ideal position should be at that location. Do you see the difference there? So if we compute it, the difference between where they think the college wants them to be and what they think is ideal has a difference of 4. So this is a value of 1, this one is a value of 5. They actually believe that the ideal situation is 4 positions or 4 units away from what the actual one is. Is that clear? Good. So let's say then that we ask them to rate, to answer this question. How important in your mind is it that the college gets this trade-off decision right on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being low or not very important at all, doesn't matter, and number 5 being maybe the most important decision of all? So let's say that this person answered it had an importance of 5. Now what we would do is we would come up with a valence value where we would take the difference between the actual and the ideal, 4, and multiply it by their perceived importance of 5, and it would come up with a relative valence score of 20. And you can see that would, on the scales that we provided, that is probably one of the most important disconnects between the way the world is perceived and the way they think it ought to be. Is that clear? So if I then constructed an instrument with all of these 10 trade-offs that I described, where is it? Oh, there we go. So if I did a scale with all of these 10 little trade-off decisions and put that on a simple 10-item instrument, whoa, excuse me. My cursor ran away with me here. If I asked them those 3 questions about actual and ideal and the importance, I would come up with a valence score for all 10 of those trade-offs, and then I could rank those from most important to least important based on this final calculated valence score. Is that clear? Yeah, so if there was something that they thought had only an importance of 1, and it turned out that where the college actually was, they thought was the ideal position, they would have very little incentive to change that at all, because it wasn't very important, and besides, they think it's in the right spot. So there would be no emotional energy or no emotional charge, no emotional motivation to change the current state. So that would be a low priority for potential transformation. Does that make sense? Okay, so if I now took a population of, let's say, 100 faculty members and 20 leaders and maybe 100 students, what I could do is I could do a stratified sample and come up with an average position that each one of those 3 different demographics would say as an aggregate, and come up with some kind of average statement about what that demographic thought about what was important and what should be changed. And then I could find out something maybe very important. How do these different demographics view what's going on inside the organization based on what subculture they're in? Are the students really looking at things differently than the faculty or from the senior leaders? Are the things that the senior leaders think important, maybe the students don't think that's important at all, and it reflects a different in worldview or experience. And so we could ask these questions of different demographics and use that to have a much deeper understanding of the dynamics of our social situation. And that gets to the essential idea behind qualitative research, to rapidly find areas that seem to be important as defined by the members of that organization. Is that making sense to you? Cool. So now when I think about that, this is what I come up with. I think that there are at least 4 different subcultures. There's the leaders in the college, the faculty members, the students, and then guys that I would just kind of call technicians, designers and lesson authors, who have to receive the guidance from the leadership about what kind of lessons they want, and so they design lessons that they think the leadership wants and which the faculty can teach on behalf of the students. And then each one of those could have a very different perspective based on these different tensions and trade-offs about the curriculum that they experience. So there's at least 4 different perspectives that could inform our understanding of these trade-offs in the middle. And so the research questions specifically now come down to things like this. Where does each one of those 4 different stakeholder groups want the curriculum to be? What is the ideal state? And then where does each of those groups think that the leadership really wants it to be? Do they really trust the leadership to say what they mean? Or is there a disconnect between what we do and what we say? We could ask these different groups, where is it intended to be, and then where is it actually, and why is there a difference? And then ask them, where do you think it should be, to see if there's a big difference between the ideal and the actual. And then asking them the questions about what's important, or what's the relative importance of these trade-offs. We could then find out what their interests are on this competing values model, and then use that to come to maybe a better design for our curriculum. And so here's what that might actually look like. We might pick a trade-off and have our little scale here of the 7-point Likert scale, and maybe we decided collectively that everybody agreed it was about a 7 on a scale of 10 for importance. And then we might have these 4 groups labeled leaders, designers, faculty, and students, LDFS. And we might describe I as the ideal and A as the actual. So we might pick a trade-off, and we could say this might be something that happens. We could say for the first trade-off that the leadership's intent comes in here at like 2.5, and then where they think it actually is down here by 1.5. So the first thing we could measure is delta number 1. What's the difference between where the leadership thinks it should be and where they think it actually is? And then we might then map the faculty, and if the faculty came in and put the faculty ideal is over here at positive 1.5, and the actual is at positive 0.5, we could then do delta number 2, which is the difference in the faculty opinion about where they think it is and where it should be. Does that make sense? The delta 1 and 2? So the third delta is we could take a look at the difference in perceptions between where the faculty think it actually is and where the leadership thinks it actually is. That could be a problem if the leadership is never getting into the classroom and they're basing where they think it is on intuition or anecdote, or they're just dreaming about it, or they don't really know. So delta 3 compares the difference between the perception of where leaders and faculty members think the college actually is on that trade-off. And then the fourth delta, a really important one in my view, is the difference between the leader's ideal state and the faculty member's ideal state. If there was a difference this much where the leaders were at negative 2.5 and the faculty were 1.5 on the other one, we would have a real cultural problem about trust and confidence and support if the leadership and the faculty were that far apart on what they thought was very important or where the college ought to be on a particular trade-off. You can see how that could create extreme challenges when it came to teaching the way that the leaders wanted it to be taught. If the faculty aren't buying into it, there's a creation of some real potential problems in there. Now, I only show leaders and faculty here, but the same idea could be expanded to the students as well, and maybe the designers, to see exactly where these different populations, these different demographics, all of whom are stakeholders in this process, and you can quickly see how there could be tension in a large organization that's not satisfied with how our designs and our implementations are actually being carried out. That everybody has these different opinions, and that builds in tension and potential conflict and dissatisfaction. And one of the ways that we can start addressing that is by mapping our locations on these trade-offs to see just what areas we agree on and which ones that we can agree are most important, and then try to go after the ones that have the highest payoff. That's where the valencing technique comes into play, as a way to quickly find out what are the high payoff areas for change as voted on by members of the organization. So they get to say in their own words, and then the role of the consultant or the researcher is simply to provide them a technique or a method that allows them to uncover where these different interest groups are on this scale of competing values. That's the essence of this qualitative research design that I've been describing. In some ways, this could be a case study. If I wanted to get a lot of data from different points of view and from external sources, and to frame it as a way of let's study how they actually made a decision, that would be a case study. If I wanted to describe the culture of this organization, I might choose an ethnographic study where I took a sample of a couple people from each of those different four populations and go deeply into their story and show how they are representative of these very different categories of groups. Is that making sense? If I went the way of phenomenology, I would be really more interested in how people made sense of this tension and dynamic. What did they do to cope with it? How did they experience it in their lives? What accommodations did they make? As opposed to trying to solve the problem, it's really just to understand the impact as seen through the eyes of the participants. That would be a phenomenological approach. If I wanted to do a grounded theory approach, I might start with this data and then try to form some kind of theory that would help me explain why these different groups took different positions on what should be, you would expect in some ways, for there to be a lot of consensus among members of a profession that shared so many things in common, and yet there seems to be tension. So a grounded theory approach would take this data and then try to produce a satisfying explanation for why these things are the way they are. That would be a grounded theory approach. If I wanted to take a look at the routine procedures by which these decisions were made, almost unconsciously, I would be looking at an ethno methodology, which is the I talked about early in the briefing. So even with this, with what I have so far, there is still a choice to be made among at least 5 different methods of qualitative research that would take a particular angle or a different perspective and shape the research questions more carefully so that I could be more precise about what it was I really wanted to study, what it was that I really wanted to answer. So that's really the next part of this, is to say, let me clarify what it is that I actually want to study so that I can decide on the particular methodology and make sure that I'm consistent between the method and the data gathering and analysis technique and the research questions I ultimately want to answer. So that's what I wanted. That's where I am in this process right now. I'm trying to give this briefing to members of my college so that they can understand the potential for improving the way we go about defining our mission and our collective understanding, and exposing some of our frustrations to the bright light to see if we can't turn that into productive energy and get closer, at least have the professional debate out in the open about where we think we want to be, instead of guys grumbling at their desk about this place. Let's have the professional discussion in the open and decide collectively where we want to go. So that's why I'm hoping to introduce them to the principles of qualitative research as a way to help them do a better job of organizing the way we do business, of clarifying our intent and our outcomes, using this kind of a model and a technique as a way to do that. Along the way, it also supports the idea of research inquiry and freedom of expression and academic integrity and academic freedom, all of which are important parts of our culture inside a college. So, any questions on any of this stuff so far? If not, that's about everything I wanted to cover on this one. That's a pretty good hour, and I really appreciate you hanging in there with me and giving me an azimuth check to make sure that what I'm saying is making sense to you. So hopefully that gives you something to think about as you start looking at how you might be applying these different methodological choices that I've laid out into your own area of interest, and realize just how many different ways you can look at the same situation and tweak it a little bit to come up with a particular qualitative research design. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and sign off there and let you think about that. We can talk about that more in the future, and maybe we can get some of these ideas into our discussions on the discussion board, and we'll take it from there. So that's everything I wanted to cover. You have a good night. Keep up the good work. You're doing a great job on the discussion.